My husband smirked when I walked into court without a lawyer, convinced I was about to lose everything. But the moment his attorney reviewed a single document, his confidence vanished. What happened next exposed a secret neither of them expected and changed the entire case. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who completely underestimated your worth. My name is Maya, and I am 32 years old. Up until a sweltering Tuesday afternoon last month, I thought I was navigating a difficult but manageable marriage. I had just returned to Atlanta after a grueling 4-day conference in Washington, to my husband Julian and his status-obsessed family. I was just attending another boring tax seminar to maintain my modest accounting credentials. In their eyes, I was merely a low-level number cruncher who did bookkeeping for local nail salons and mom-and-pop grocery stores. They had no idea that my conference was actually a high-level briefing with federal agencies. I am an independent forensic accountant, a specialized financial investigator, contracted to track dark money, expose corporate embezzlement, and build cases against white-collar criminals. I kept my true career and my substantial income hidden to protect Julian's fragile ego. He needed to be the undisputed provider, the brilliant investment executive who rescued his wife from her working-class background. I played the role of the quiet, unassuming wife because I loved him and valued our marriage over my own pride. I was about to learn just how misplaced that loyalty truly was. The oppressive Georgia heat shimmered off the asphalt as my rideshare pulled into our exclusive Buckhead neighborhood. Our home was a magnificent $1.2 million red brick estate surrounded by ancient oak trees and a manicured lawn that looked like a velvet carpet. I had paid the entire down payment myself through a shell corporation, letting Julian believe his bonus had somehow covered the massive expense. As the car rounded the sweeping circular driveway, my exhaustion evaporated, replaced by a sudden icy shock. There, piled haphazardly on the pristine green grass near the front porch, were dozens of cheap black plastic trash bags. I thanked the driver, stepped out of the vehicle, and walked slowly toward the lawn. My heart pounded against my ribs as a familiar piece of fabric caught my eye. Poking out of a torn bag was the silk lining of my favorite tailored blazer. These were my clothes, my personal belongings, my shoes, my books, all stuffed into garbage bags, like refuse, waiting for the sanitation truck. The sheer disrespect of the display was breathtaking. I did not scream. I did not fall to my knees in despair. A cold, calculated calm washed over me, the same detached focus I utilized when dissecting a fraudulent corporate ledger. I gripped the handle of my travel suitcase and walked up the wide stone steps to the heavy mahogany front door. I pushed the door open, stepping into the grand foyer. The familiar scent of expensive sandalwood and vintage bourbon drifted from the sunken living room. I walked quietly down the hallway, the sound of my heels muffled by the thick Persian rugs. When I reached the living room archway, the scene before me looked like a carefully staged theatrical production of Betrayal. Julian, my husband of 6 years, sat comfortably on the custom Italian leather sofa. He was wearing his tailored designer suit, holding a crystal glass of his favorite bourbon, looking completely unbothered. Sitting pressed against his side was a woman I had never seen before. She was young, heavily made up, and her hand rested protectively over a very obvious rounded pregnant belly. Julian had his arm draped casually behind her shoulders. Lounging in my favorite velvet reading chair across from them was Chantel, Julian's older sister. Chantel was a 34-year-old self-proclaimed socialite who owned a luxury fashion boutique downtown. She wore a silk designer dress and oversized sunglasses indoors, radiating the haughty arrogance she had weaponized against me since the day we met. Chantel was the first to notice me standing in the archway. She took a slow sip from her champagne flute and let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed in the high-ceilinged room. "Do not look so shocked," Maya Chantel sneered slowly, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. "You really thought this charade was going to last forever? You crawled out of a public state college right into Julian's tax bracket. He paid off your little student loans. He put a roof over your head. You got to play pretend with the black elite for a few years, but playtime is officially over. Now take your little trash bags out front and go back to doing taxes for those cheap nail salons on the south side. You never belonged in our world anyway." Her words were designed to cut deeply, playing on the insecurities they assumed I harbored. Julian's family took immense pride in their generational wealth and their legacy at prestigious historically black colleges and universities. Julian was a proud Morehouse man, and Chantel never missed an opportunity to remind me of her Spelman degree. They had always viewed my state college education and my quiet demeanor as proof of my inferiority. I looked from Chantel to the pregnant woman sitting next to my husband. The woman offered me a smug, triumphant smile, clearly relishing her position as the new woman of the house. Julian finally set his bourbon glass down on the marble coffee table. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, projecting the image of a powerful, commanding executive dismissing an incompetent employee. "Let us keep this brief and professional." Maya, Julian said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Chloe and I are starting a family. A real family. You have been too focused on your little accounting hobbies to be a proper wife, and frankly, I need a woman who fits my lifestyle. It is time for you to leave." I remained silent, absorbing the magnitude of his audacity. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, tossing them carelessly onto the kitchen island that separated the living room from the cooking area. "Those are divorce papers," he stated coldly. "And before you start crying and threatening to take my money, you should know that I drained all of our joint checking and savings accounts this morning. Every single penny has been moved to a secure individual trust. You have $0 to your name right now. You cannot even afford to hire the cheapest lawyer in Atlanta." Chantel giggled from her chair, clearly delighted by my apparent financial ruin. Julian stood up, walking slowly toward the island, towering over the paperwork. "Here is how this is going to work," he commanded, pointing a manicured finger at the signature line. "You are going to sign these papers right now. You are going to waive any right to spousal support, and you are going to forfeit any claim to this house in exchange. I will graciously allow you to keep that old Honda Civic you drove before we got married, and I will not pursue you for the money I wasted supporting you these past 6 years. Sign the papers, take your garbage bags off my lawn, and leave quietly. If you try to fight me, my lawyers will bury you in so much debt you will never recover." The room was heavy with their shared anticipation. They were waiting for the breakdown. They expected me to drop to my knees, to scream, to beg for a second chance, or to dissolve into a puddle of hysterical tears. They believed they had outsmarted a naive, simple-minded woman who relied entirely on their charity to survive. They were absolutely convinced they held all the power. I looked down at the divorce papers on the marble counter. Then I looked up at Julian, meeting his arrogant gaze with absolute tranquility. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. Instead, a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was the kind of smile that made Julian flinch just slightly as a flicker of confusion crossed his features. I reached into my handbag and pulled out my smartphone. Without breaking eye contact with my husband, I opened a custom application I had developed specifically for my high-value assets. I tapped a single button on the screen. Instantly, a piercing alarm erupted from the garage. His prized Porsche was dead. I smiled. "You forgot who actually financed that car under their private LLC. The title and the remote kill switch belong entirely to me," I whispered. "Enjoy walking to work." I walked away, smiling. I walked out of that house and did not look back. The humid Atlanta air hit my face, but I felt nothing but ice-cold clarity. I checked into a modest extended-stay hotel downtown, avoiding the luxury spots where Julian or his social climbing family might easily find me. My room was basic, just a bed, a small desk, and a kitchenette, but it was a fortress where I could plan my next move. I barely slept that night, my mind racing through ledgers, financial statements, and the sheer audacity of the betrayal I had just witnessed. By morning, I had already set up a secure proxy network on my laptop, ready to dive deeper into the financial mess Julian thought he had trapped me in. I was just pouring my first cup of terrible hotel coffee when a sharp, aggressive knock echoed through my room. I had not told anyone where I was staying, but the Black Elite network in Atlanta is small, and Beatrice, my mother-in-law, had eyes everywhere. I opened the door to find Beatrice standing in the hallway, looking like she had just stepped out of a Society magazine spread. She wore a tailored cream suit, her pearls perfectly placed, projecting the image of the flawless matriarch who controlled the local Jack and Jill chapter with an iron fist. Standing right beside her was Reverend Silas, the head of the megachurch. Our family attended a man whose expensive tailored suits were funded by the very congregation he preached to. Beatrice pushed past me without an invitation, her heels clicking sharply against the cheap linoleum floor. Reverend Silas followed, closing the door behind him with a heavy, definitive thud. I crossed my arms, watching them take over my small space. Maya, what on earth is wrong with you? Beatrice began, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. I just came from the house. Julian had to change the locks because you are acting completely erratic. You left your clothes and trash bags on the lawn for the entire neighborhood to see. Do you have any idea how that looks? The neighbors are already gossiping. I stared at her, letting the sheer hypocrisy of her words hang in the air. Julian was sitting on our couch with his pregnant mistress, Beatrice. I said, my voice dangerously calm. He handed me divorce papers and told me he drained our accounts. But you are worried about the landscaping. Beatrice waved her hand dismissively, as if I had just complained about the weather. Julian is a successful, high-earning black man, she declared, lifting her chin. He carries a lot of stress managing that investment firm. He has needs that clearly you are not meeting. You have been too focused on your little accounting hobby, hiding behind your computer screen, instead of supporting him at social events. You are his wife, Maya. You are supposed to be his peace, not his problem. The term little accounting hobby made my blood boil. Beatrice had always looked down on me because I did not graduate from a prestigious private institution like Spelman or Howard. I went to a state school on a full scholarship and worked my way up. She loved to parade Julian around as the self-made genius of the family, the brilliant financial mind who single-handedly elevated their status. Support him, I repeated, stepping closer to her. Who do you think paid for that lavish anniversary party you threw last month, Beatrice? Who do you think covered the balloon payment on Chantel's luxury boutique when the bank threatened to seize her inventory? Julian did not pay for any of that. I did. I pulled the money from my private consulting contracts to keep this family from drowning in debt while you all played rich for the cameras. Beatrice scoffed, her expression hardening. Do not stand there and lie to me. Julian is an executive. He makes the money in this family. You just balance the checkbooks for local shops. You should be on your knees thanking God that a man of his caliber even looked your way. Now you are going to sign those papers, apologize to my son, and maybe if you show some genuine remorse, he will give you a small allowance to get you back on your feet. Do not embarrass this family in front of the congregation, Maya. We have an image to uphold. Reverend Silas stepped forward, attempting to use his pastoral authority to intimidate me. Sister Maya, he said, using his deep, resonant preaching voice. Pride goes before a fall. The institution of marriage requires sacrifice, and sometimes it requires a woman to swallow her pride for the greater good of the family unit. Julian is a pillar of our church community. By dragging this out, you are not just hurting him, you are damaging the spiritual fabric of our congregation. The Lord calls us to forgive. I looked at the Reverend, feeling a profound sense of disgust. He was not here to offer spiritual guidance. He was here as a hired gun, a tool Beatrice brought along to enforce compliance through religious guilt. I slowly reached out and tapped the screen of my smartwatch, ensuring the voice memo application was recording every single word of this extortion attempt. Forgiveness is a beautiful concept, Reverend Silas, I replied smoothly. But right now we are talking about asset division and fraud. Julian tried to leave me with absolutely nothing while saddling me with the debt from his sister's failing business. That is not a marital disagreement, that is financial abuse. Beatrice stepped right into my personal space, her eyes flashing with pure malice. You listen to me, you ungrateful little girl. You have zero capital, you have no legal representation, you are going up against people who have deep pockets and powerful friends. If you do not sign those papers and walk away quietly, we will destroy whatever is left of your pathetic reputation. We will make sure you never work in this city again. You will be back in the projects before the month is over. The absolute confidence in her voice was staggering. She truly believed I was a helpless victim, a peasant they had temporarily allowed into their royal court. She thought I was isolated and powerless. What Beatrice did not know was that I spent my days hunting down corporate criminals who were 10 times smarter and 100 times richer than her arrogant son. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her aggressive energy. I simply smiled, a cold, sharp smile that made Beatrice hesitate. I walked over to the small hotel desk where my encrypted laptop sat open. I glanced at the screen, verifying a piece of data I had uncovered late last night while tracing Julian's messy financial footprints. I turned back to them, folding my arms. "You are very protective of the church's image, Reverend Silas," I said conversationally. "And Beatrice, you are obsessed with maintaining the illusion of black excellence. It is fascinating, really, how much energy you both put into keeping up appearances." "What are you talking about?" Beatrice snapped, losing some of her regal composure. I walked slowly toward the door, opening it wide for them to leave. I leaned in close to Beatrice, dropping my voice to a whisper that only she and the Reverend could hear. "Does Reverend Silas know that Julian used the church's multi-million-dollar building fund as collateral for Chantel's failing boutique? Because I do, and I have the wire transfer logs to prove it." I watched the blood completely drain from Beatrice's face. Her flawless makeup suddenly looked like a mask painted on a ghost. Reverend Silas choked on his own breath, his eyes darting frantically between me and Beatrice. The righteous authority melted off him, instantly replaced by raw, undisguised panic. "Have a blessed day," I said. I slammed the door in their faces. I stood alone in the quiet hotel room, listening to their hurried footsteps retreating down the hallway. The silence that followed was intoxicating. For years I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace in a family that viewed me as nothing more than a convenient accessory. I had played the submissive wife, the quiet accountant, the grateful outsider. But the moment Julian handed me those divorce papers and tried to erase my entire existence, he unleashed a version of me they were completely unprepared to handle. I walked back to my laptop and sat down at the cramped desk. The screen glowed with complex spreadsheets routing numbers and offshore account data. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I executed a series of secure background checks. Beatrice thought she could intimidate me with threats of social ruin. She thought the power of the church and their country club connections would force me into submission. But social status means absolutely nothing when facing federal financial crimes. I pulled up the exact digital footprint of the church building fund. It was worse than I had initially thought. Julian had not just used it as collateral, he had actively siphoned funds to cover the monthly operating costs of Chantel's boutique. The boutique was bleeding money, hemorrhaging cash on counterfeit luxury goods and lavish launch parties that generated zero revenue. Julian had tried to plug the holes with church donations, relying on Reverend Silas' blind trust and lack of financial oversight, but that was not the only secret hidden in the ledgers. As I dug deeper, I found the guarantor forms for the boutique's massive commercial lease. Julian had forged my signature, making me personally liable for $1.5 million in commercial debt. He planned to divorce me, leave me penniless, and let the creditors destroy my life, while he and his pregnant mistress rode off into the sunset. A fierce protective anger burned in my chest. I opened a new encrypted file and began compiling every piece of evidence. I documented the forged signatures, the IP addresses, the illegal wire transfers, and the exact timestamps of Julian's movements. I was not just building a divorce case, I was building a federal indictment. I was going to dismantle their entire empire brick by brick, and I was going to do it in broad daylight. My phone buzzed on the desk, breaking my concentration. It was an unknown number. I let it ring twice before answering, knowing exactly who would be on the other end of the line. The family machinery was already in motion, attempting to crush the rebellion before it could start. The enablers had failed. Now it was time for the executioner. I picked up the phone, pressing it to my ear without saying a word. I knew Julian had realized the severity of the situation with his Porsche. He was a man who relied entirely on the illusion of control, and I had just publicly stripped him of it. The realization that I was not the helpless victim he had banked on must have sent him spiraling into a panic. But Julian was predictable. When he felt threatened, he did not retreat, he escalated. He would use his wealth, or rather, the wealth he pretended was his, to hire the most vicious legal representation he could find. I looked at the glowing screen of my computer, watching the data packets compile into irrefutable proof of his crimes. Being a forensic accountant meant I did not deal in emotions or hearsay. I dealt in absolute, undeniable facts. Numbers do not lie. They do not care about your social standing, your designer suits, or your country club memberships. Numbers tell the story of your choices. And Julian's choices had led him straight into a federal trap of his own making. I closed the laptop, securing the hard drive with a biometric lock. I had given Beatrice and Reverend Sus a warning, a small taste of the destruction I was capable of unleashing. They thought they could silence me with shame. They were about to learn that a woman with nothing left to lose and access to your financial secrets is the most dangerous adversary on earth. I grabbed my hotel keycard and stepped out into the hallway, ready to face whatever arrogant attorney Julian had unleashed upon me. My smartphone vibrated violently against my palm before the heavy wooden door of my room could even click shut. The screen displayed a restricted number. Julian lacked the spine to confront me directly after his mother and her hired reverend failed their intimidation mission. He would naturally deploy his legal attack dog to do the dirty work. I swiped to accept the call and lifted the device to my ear, maintaining a perfectly steady breathing rhythm. "Speak," I commanded flatly. "Is this Maya Wilson?" a male voice demanded. The tone was sharp, dripping with the kind of polished elitism that men in custom Italian suits used to establish dominance over people they deemed beneath them. "You called my personal cell phone," I replied, leaning against the muted wallpaper of the hotel corridor. "State your business." "This is Richard Sterling, senior partner at Sterling and Hayes," the voice announced, carrying a theatrical weight, as if expecting me to gasp at his prestige. "I represent your husband, Julian Wilson, in your impending divorce and asset division proceedings. I am contacting you as a courtesy, Maya. Julian informed me that you chose to behave erratically this morning, refusing to sign the amicable separation agreement he generously prepared. I am calling to offer you one final opportunity to resolve this quietly before I bring the full weight of my firm down upon you." "Generously prepared," I repeated, allowing a dry laugh to escape my lips. "You mean the paperwork where he takes the $1 million estate, the luxury vehicles, and my dignity, while leaving me with a 10-year-old sedan and empty pockets? If that is your definition of generosity, Mr. Sterling, I would hate to see your definition of robbery." Sterling exhaled sharply, clearly annoyed that I was not cowering. "You need to understand your position, young lady. Julian has officially filed a motion to sever his financial liability from your disastrous business dealings." My business dealings?" I asked, my voice dropping an octave. "Do not play ignorant with me," Maya Sterling snapped. "We have the fully executed financial guarantor forms. You signed as the primary liability holder for the commercial lease and the operational credit lines tied to Chantel's boutique. That business is currently operating at a catastrophic loss. Since you are the guarantor, Julian is legally petitioning the court to saddle you with the entirety of that debt. $1.5 million to be exact." I stood frozen in the hallway. Julian had not merely drained our joint accounts, he had actively forged my signature to make me the fall guy for his sister's massive financial negligence. He intended to walk away clean while leaving me to face absolute financial ruin. Sterling took my silence as submission. His voice softened into a sickeningly patronizing croon. "You have zero capital, no legal representation, and you are up against the top firm in Atlanta. Surrender now, or you will be paying off your sister-in-law's designer inventory for the rest of your life. Sign the original documents Julian provided, and we will withdraw the debt motion. Fight us, and I will personally see to it that your wages are garnished until you are 60 years old. Have I made myself perfectly clear?" I did not yell. I did not hurl insults. I simply pressed the end call button, terminating his arrogant monologue mid-sentence. I turned around, swiped my keycard, and walked right back into my hotel room. I secured the deadbolt fastening and pulled the blackout curtains tightly shut. The time for playing the passive discarded wife was officially over. I walked over to my desk and unzipped the hidden false bottom of my leather travel tote. I pulled out my secondary laptop. It was not the cheap commercial brand Julian thought I used for bookkeeping. This was a heavy matte black machine encased in military-grade titanium. It contained zero personal files, zero social media applications, and absolute maximum encryption. Julian and his elitist family genuinely believed I spent my days balancing ledgers for nail salons and corner stores. They mocked my state college degree and laughed at my modest wardrobe. They never bothered to look past their own classist assumptions. If they had, they might have discovered that I am an elite independent forensic accountant. I do not do taxes for small businesses. I am a ghost contractor for federal agencies, the FBI, the Treasury Department, and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Hire me to track dark money, unspool corporate embezzlement schemes, and build airtight cases against white-collar criminals. I hunt arrogant men in custom suits for a living. I powered on the machine and bypassed 3 separate layers of biometric security protocols. The screen flared to life, displaying a complex network of terminal windows and encrypted databases. Sterling thought he had me backed into a corner with his $1.5 million threat. He assumed I was a terrified amateur facing the top firm in Atlanta. What he failed to realize was that he had just handed a federal financial hunter the exact thread she needed to unravel his client's entire criminal enterprise. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I did not need to petition the court for discovery to see those guarantor forms. I bypassed the standard legal channels and connected directly to the cloud servers hosting the accounting software used by Chantel's boutique. Julian had insisted Chantel use a specific inventory and accounting program to manage her store. I thought it was a brilliant cost-saving measure because his quiet wife had installed it for free. What Julian did not know was that I wrote the foundational architecture for that specific software during a federal contract 2 years ago. I knew every line of code, every hidden registry, and every backdoor access port. I bypassed the boutique's rudimentary firewall in less than 30 seconds. I pulled up the master ledger for the boutique. The financial bleeding was immediately apparent. Chantel was hemorrhaging money on counterfeit luxury goods, purchasing cheap knockoffs and attempting to sell them at astronomical markups to her wealthy socialite friends. But the retail fraud was minor compared to the structured embezzlement I found hidden in the accounts payable column. I searched for the specific commercial lease agreements and the operational credit lines Sterling had threatened me with. I located the digital PDF files buried in a restricted subfolder. I opened the guarantor forms. There, staring back at me, was my own signature perfectly rendered at the bottom of the page. To an untrained eye or a lazy divorce attorney, it looked flawless. But Julian was fundamentally lazy. He had not printed the document and forged my name by hand. He had used a digital signature rendering tool to copy and paste my e-signature from a joint tax return. I opened my terminal window and ran a deep metadata extraction protocol on the forged PDF. Every digital action leaves a footprint. When you apply an electronic signature to a secure financial document, the software automatically logs the exact timestamp, the device, MAC address, and the geolocation IP address of the machine executing the signature. Lines of green code scrolled rapidly down my black screen as the software stripped away the document's encrypted layers. I watched intensely, waiting for the registry to reveal its secrets. The program chimed softly. The metadata displayed in crisp, glowing text. The signature had been applied on October 14th at 2:14 in the morning. I checked the device registry. It was not signed from my computer, or even from the boutique. The MAC address perfectly matched Julian's personal MacBook Pro. I ran a trace on the IP address, routing the location data through a satellite mapping tool. The geographic coordinates locked onto a luxury apartment building in Midtown Atlanta. It was the exact address of Chloe's apartment, the pregnant mistress sitting on my sofa earlier that morning. Julian had literally forged federal financial documents, placing me in massive debt while lying in bed with his mistress. He used his personal computer and her local internet connection, leaving a blazing digital trail pointing directly to his own guilt. I leaned back in the cheap hotel desk chair and let out a low, dark laugh. Julian and Sterling thought they were playing chess against an unarmed opponent. They thought they could use the legal system to bludgeon me into submission. Instead, they had blindly walked into a trap. I downloaded the raw metadata files, the original forged PDFs, and the boutique routing numbers transferring everything to a secure offline drive. I organized the data packets into a pristine, legally admissible format, ensuring that no high-priced attorney could ever dispute their authenticity. I stared at the glowing screen, my reflection catching in the dark glass. Julian wanted to play dirty. He wanted to use his power, his money, and his status to break me. He believed he was untouchable behind the shield of black excellence and corporate prestige. I closed the laptop, sliding it safely back into the hidden compartment of my bag. I picked up my phone and opened a fresh message window to Julian. I typed out a single sentence, deleting it before pressing send. Silence would frighten him far more than a threat. "You just handed me the federal wire fraud evidence I needed, Julian," I whispered to the empty room. The morning sun burned off the remaining hotel room chill as I stepped onto the Atlanta pavement. I hailed a premium black car service, not a budget ride share, and directed the driver toward the affluent neighborhood of Buckhead. The transition from my sterile temporary lodging to the ultra-wealthy shopping district felt like crossing a border between two completely different realities. I was heading straight into the heart of Chantel's territory. Her luxury boutique Maison de Chantel occupied prime real estate on a street corner that commanded astronomical commercial rent. It was a space meticulously designed to project intimidating wealth, with its floor-to-ceiling tempered glass displays and minimalist gold leaf lettering. But as my driver pulled up to the pristine curb, I did not see a thriving retail enterprise. Through the highly trained lens of a forensic accountant, I saw a desperately bleeding liability that was propped up entirely by stolen capital. I pushed open the heavy brass-handled glass door. The little silver bell above the frame chimed cheerfully, but the welcoming sound was immediately drowned out by Chantel's sharp, screeching voice echoing from the back of the store. I walked quietly past racks of overpriced silk garments and sparse displays of supposedly imported leather goods. I found my sister-in-law, cornering a young, terrified sales associate behind the main marble register. The girl could not have been older than 20, and she was visibly shaking while clutching a stack of mismatched inventory receipts against her chest. "Are you completely incompetent?" Chantel yelled, snatching the papers out of the girl's hands with a vicious jerk. "I told you to log these incoming shipments under the secondary overseas vendor code. Do they teach basic math at whatever community college you attend, or do I need to hold your hand through a simple data entry task?" The girl stammered a frantic apology, but Chantel was absolutely relentless. "I do not pay you to be sorry. I pay you to follow my exact instructions. Get to the stockroom and fix this digital mess before I fire you and ruin your retail resume." The poor girl practically ran past me, her eyes shining with unshed tears as she fled toward the back room. I stepped fully into the bright light of the crystal chandelier hanging above the cash wrap. "Your leadership style is exactly as inspiring as your business model, Chantel," I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the empty boutique. Chantel whipped around, her face twisting in genuine shock before quickly settling into a cruel practiced sneer. She leaned against the marble counter, crossing her arms over her designer silk blouse. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," she scoffed, eyeing my simple tailored dress with open disdain. "Did you come here to beg for a job, Maya? Because I just told that girl I might have an opening for someone who knows how to scrub toilets and sweep floors." I walked slowly toward her, running my fingers lightly over a rack of Italian leather jackets. "I am not looking for employment, Chantel. I just wanted to see the $1.5 million sinkhole Julian expects me to pay for." Chantel threw her head back and let out a loud, grating laugh that bounced off the mirrored walls. "Oh, so you finally found out about the guarantor paperwork. Good. That saves Sterling an extra phone call today. Julian completely cut you off this morning. You are entirely broke, Maya. You have absolutely nothing to your name. You are going to carry my commercial debt, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it." She stepped out from behind the counter, closing the distance between us, as if trying to physically intimidate me with her height and her expensive perfume. "You thought you were so clever playing the quiet little supportive wife while living off my brother's financial genius. Julian built this family. He built this business empire. And now he is protecting his bloodline's wealth from parasites like you." "Julian did not build anything," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level and devoid of emotion. "He just moved numbers around on a screen and hoped no one would look too closely at the margins." Chantel scoffed, waving a freshly manicured hand inches from my face. Do not speak about high-level finance that you cannot possibly comprehend. You crawled out of a public state school with a useless degree and zero social connections. This family has a legacy that spans generations. My grandfather built real estate across the South. Julian dominates the corporate investment sector. I hold a degree from Spelman and run a premier luxury destination for Atlanta's elite. We are the definition of black excellence, Maya. You are just a working-class charity case we allowed to sit at our dinner table. She gestured wildly at the racks of clothing and the illuminated display walls. You do not even know what true luxury is. You probably still shop at discount outlets and pretend you cannot tell the difference. I turned my attention fully to a display of highly coveted designer handbags resting on a backlit acrylic shelf. I picked up a cherry red leather tote that was supposedly retailing for $4,000. I ran my thumb along the interior seam, feeling the stiff, cheap industrial glue holding the fabric lining together. I checked the gold hardware, noting the slightly uneven brass plating and the glaring lack of a proper serial number stamp inside the interior pocket. True luxury, I mused, turning the counterfeit bag over in my hands, inspecting the sloppy machine stitching. Is that what we are calling imported, mass-produced knockoffs now, Chantel? Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second, her internal panic barely concealed before she masked it with loud, theatrical outrage. Put that down immediately. You cannot afford to breathe on that bag, let alone handle it with your greasy fingers. I set the fake bag back on its pristine pedestal. The pieces of the financial puzzle clicked together perfectly in my mind, forming a crystal-clear picture of federal wire fraud. Julian was washing his stolen investment pension funds through Chantel's store by creating fake inventory invoices. He would transfer the embezzled corporate cash to the boutique, claiming it was for high-end merchandise acquisition. Chantel would buy cheap counterfeits from overseas suppliers, pocket a massive fraction of the cash to keep her lavish lifestyle afloat, and then log the sales as legitimate luxury transactions to clean the dirty money. It was a classic rudimentary money laundering scheme, wrapped tightly in a facade of elite socialite status. They were not just arrogant, they were incredibly and dangerously sloppy. I think I will purchase something a bit more my speed, I said, walking over to a small glass bowl near the register, filled with branded promotional accessories. I picked up a simple metal keychain stamped with the boutique's stylized logo. This $20 trinket should do just fine. Chantel rolled her eyes, heavily moving back behind the register to ring me up. Paying with loose change from your sofa cushions, Maya. Or are you hoping I will just give it to you out of pity since your husband locked your debit cards? I reached into my handbag and pulled out a sleek, heavy metal black card. It bore no commercial bank logo and no identifying markers other than a specialized embedded microchip. It was a highly secure federal expense account card linked directly to my independent forensic contracting firm. It was the card issued to me by the very agencies that hunted people like Julian and Chantel. I handed the heavy card to Chantel. She snatched it from my fingers, swiping it aggressively through her point-of-sale terminal reader. The moment the magnetic strip registered, the entire digital cash register system froze completely. The monitor's screen flickered, turning a solid glaring white, before a stream of green diagnostic code began scrolling rapidly across the display. Chantel slammed her palm against the side of the machine, her frustration peaking. What did you do to my register? What is wrong with your cheap plastic card? The terminal chimed loudly, completely overriding the store's soft background music. My custom security bypass code embedded in the card's chip had just perfectly interfaced with the accounting software I originally built for her store years ago as a favor to Julian. I had just initiated a remote download of her entire unedited daily transaction log right into my secure cloud server. The card is perfectly fine, Chantel, I said, retrieving the heavy metal rectangle from her trembling fingers as the machine reset itself. Your system just recognized a superior operating protocol and needed a moment to catch up. Chantel was frantic now, pressing buttons on the frozen screen, trying desperately to get her operating system back online before she lost her morning sales data. Get out of my store, she demanded, her voice rising in genuine panic. Get out right now before I call mall security and have you arrested for criminal vandalism and trespassing. I picked up my $20 keychain and leaned directly over the cold marble counter. I deliberately invaded her personal space, dropping my voice to a sharp, precise whisper that cut right through her rising hysteria. You should really check your inventory logs, Chantel. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division has a funny habit of aggressively auditing boutiques that report $2 million in sales with zero imported freight records to match. Chantel gasped sharply, stepping backward as if I had physically struck her across the face. She stumbled in her high heels, and her elbow caught the edge of a tall glass display case filled with expensive counterfeit perfumes. The heavy case tipped forward, shattering against the hardwood floor with a deafening violent crash. Shards of glass and cheap pungent cologne exploded everywhere, soaking the hem of her designer dress and ruining her shoes. She stood frozen amid the sparkling wreckage, her mouth hanging open in pure, unadulterated shock. I turned my back on the destruction and walked out the heavy glass door, leaving her drowning in the reality of her own ruined empire. The crisp afternoon air hit my face as I walked away from the shattered glass and ruined inventory of Maison de Chantel. I did not need to be a fly on the wall to know exactly what was happening next. Chantel would be scrambling for her phone, her manicured fingers slipping on the screen as she dialed her brother in absolute hysterics. Julian would answer, expecting a routine update on their money laundering operation, only to hear that his quiet, unassuming wife possessed a federal black card and intimate knowledge of their fraudulent imports. Julian operated strictly on the illusion of control, and I had just dismantled his fake empire. Panic would be setting in like a fast-acting poison. He would react with blind, arrogant aggression. He would call Richard Sterling and demand that the divorce proceedings and the debt transfer motion be expedited immediately. He would want me crushed before I could mount any defense. He wanted a swift execution. I was counting on it. I spent the next 2 days organizing my digital evidence into an impenetrable fortress of data. Every forged signature and routed IP address was categorized and cross-referenced. I built a financial timeline so damning that a first-year law student could use it to secure a federal conviction. By Thursday morning, I decided I needed a change of scenery from the hotel room. I walked 3 blocks to a high-end independent coffee shop in Midtown, taking a seat at a small corner table facing the door. I ordered a black coffee and opened my encrypted laptop, running a final diagnostic on the metadata files. I knew Julian would find me. My phone was untraceable, but I had deliberately used my old personal credit card, the one still tethered to our frozen joint accounts, to pay for the coffee. It would send an automatic ping to his phone, acting as a digital flare signaling my exact location. I was inviting the ambush. Less than 20 minutes later, the heavy glass door of the coffee shop swung open violently. Julian stormed inside. He was wearing one of his custom-tailored navy suits, but the immaculate presentation was ruined by the frantic energy rolling off him. His tie was slightly askew, and a fine sheen of sweat coated his forehead, despite the cool air conditioning of the cafe. He scanned the room, his eyes locking onto me with a mixture of intense relief and burning rage. He marched across the polished concrete floor, drawing curious glances from the patrons at the adjacent tables. He did not care about the audience. He needed a public victory to soothe his bruised ego. He stopped right in front of my small table, looming over me to cast a shadow across my laptop screen. He slammed a thick, heavy manila folder down onto the wooden surface. I did not flinch. I slowly raised my eyes from the screen, taking in his flushed face and the aggressive set of his jaw. "You really thought you could hide from me, Maya?" he demanded, his voice raised loud enough to ensure the surrounding tables could hear his dominant tone. "You thought you could run around the city terrorizing my sister and locking down my vehicle without facing the consequences. You have completely lost your mind." I kept my hands resting lightly on the keyboard, projecting absolute calm. "I am sitting in a crowded coffee shop, Julian, paying for a cheap beverage with a traceable card. I am not hiding from you. I was waiting for you." He scoffed, leaning closer, placing both hands flat on the table. "You are delusional. You are playing a game you do not understand. My legal team has worked around the clock to expedite the hearings. That folder contains your official court summons for Monday morning. We pushed the docket forward. We are severing my financial liability from your disastrous choices." He tapped the thick folder with a harsh, aggressive rhythm. "You are going to court, Maya. You are going to stand in front of a judge and answer for the $1.5 million in commercial debt you guaranteed for that boutique. You thought you could scare Chantel with empty threats about the IRS, but you have no proof of anything. You are just a bitter, discarded wife, trying to cause trouble because you cannot handle the fact that I am moving on to a better life." I stared at him, letting his arrogant monologue wash over me without reacting. He wanted me to cry. He wanted me to beg for more time. He wanted me to panic at the sight of the expedited court documents. He was feeding on the anticipation of my total breakdown. "Open it," Julian commanded, pointing a sharp finger at the folder. "Open it and sign the acknowledgement of service right now." I brought a pen. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a heavy silver fountain pen, tossing it onto the table. It clattered loudly against the wood. The surrounding cafe patrons were now openly watching the spectacle Julian had created. They saw a powerful, wealthy executive putting his erratic wife in her place. They had no idea they were watching a dead man walking. I did not break eye contact with him. I did not open the folder to read the extensive legal threats Richard Sterling had undoubtedly drafted to intimidate me. I simply picked up the heavy silver pen, pulled the document slightly toward me, and signed my name in a smooth, unbroken motion right on the front cover, acknowledging receipt of the summons. I placed the pen down and slid the folder back across the table. "I am glad you rushed this, Julian," I said, my voice perfectly conversational. "It saves me the trouble of hunting you down and filing the motions myself. Monday morning works perfectly for my schedule." Julian's face contorted in confusion. He stared at my signature on the cover of the folder, his brain struggling to process my lack of resistance. He had prepared for a fight. He had prepared for tears. He had no protocol for immediate calm compliance. The reality that I was not afraid of his high-priced lawyers was deeply unsettling to his fragile ego. He quickly masked his confusion with a loud, mocking laugh, snatching the folder off the table. "You are putting on a brave face, Maya, I will give you that. But it is pathetic. You have absolutely no capital. You have no legal representation. You are going to walk into that courtroom on Monday morning completely isolated." He leaned down, bringing his face inches from mine, his breath smelling faintly of expensive scotch and raw panic. "You are walking into a slaughterhouse alone, Maya. Richard Sterling is going to tear you apart on the stand. He is going to present the signed guarantor forms, and the judge is going to ruin your life. You will be drowning in debt forever." I closed my laptop with a soft, definitive click, securing the biometric lock. I picked up my coffee cup and took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the bitter, dark roast. I let the silence stretch out, forcing Julian to wait for my response, forcing him to endure the weight of my total indifference. I set the cup down and looked directly into his eyes. The false bravado was slipping from his expression, replaced by a creeping, terrifying realization that he had severely miscalculated my capabilities. "Make sure Sterling brings the original copies of Chantel's loan applications to court," I said, my voice dropping to a low, razor-sharp whisper. "The ones signed on October 14th. Julian's entire body went rigid. The mocking smirk instantly vanished from his lips, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly under the warm cafe lighting. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. How could she possibly know the exact date he forged the documents? The question was written plainly across his shocked expression. He knew he had applied that digital signature in the dead of night inside Chloe's apartment. He knew there were no witnesses. He believed his crime was perfectly hidden behind layers of digital anonymity. I had no idea that I could track his metadata footprint with terrifying precision. I stood up from the table, smoothing the skirt of my dress. I slung my heavy encrypted bag over my shoulder and stepped around him. Julian remained frozen, his hand gripping the manila folder so tightly his knuckles were turning white. "See you in the slaughterhouse, Julian," I said quietly as I walked past him. I pushed through the heavy glass door and stepped back out into the bright Atlanta afternoon, leaving my soon-to-be ex-husband standing paralyzed in the middle of the crowded coffee shop, finally realizing that he was the sheep and I was holding the blade. The rest of my week passed in a state of hyper-focused calculation. I had successfully cornered Julian, and he was currently bleeding out in a trap of his own arrogant design. But to truly dismantle his empire of lies, I needed a public arena. I needed the exact stage he used to project his false image of Black excellence. That stage was the annual HBCU Alumni Gala, held at the towering Waldorf Astoria in downtown Atlanta. Julian had purchased a VIP table months ago. He planned to use the night to court high-level venture capitalists and secure the final round of funding for his bloated investment firm. More importantly, Julian was using the gala to debut his new life. He arrived with his mother, Beatrice, his sister Chantal, and his pregnant mistress Chloe, draped on his arm. They were parading through the grand ballroom, a unified front of elitism, actively selling the narrative that I was a tragic mistake Julian had finally corrected. I knew Beatrice had spent the entire cocktail hour whispering to the city's matriarchs about my supposed mental breakdown. She was laying the groundwork to ensure my social exile. They wanted to humiliate me by proxy proving to Atlanta society that the Wilson family had excised their working-class tumor. I did not arrive looking like the defeated broken woman they expected. I stepped out of my hired car and handed my coat to the valet, wearing a custom-tailored emerald green silk gown. It was a masterpiece of understated luxury, devoid of the flashy, oversized designer logos Chantal and Beatrice favored. My hair was styled in a flawless, sleek press, and I wore a single pair of authentic diamond drop earrings. I looked like money. Real quiet generational wealth that did not need to shout to be recognized. I bypassed the standard registration line, flashing my digital VIP credential to the host, and walked through the heavy gilded doors of the main ballroom. The cavernous room was a sea of tailored tuxedos and sequined gowns, bathed in warm amber lighting and the soft hum of a live jazz quartet. I did not immediately seek out my estranged husband. Instead, I scanned the room for the real power players. I spotted Marcus Vance standing near the grand ice sculpture. Vance was a ruthless venture capitalist, a man Julian had been desperately trying to court for over 2 years. Julian needed Vance's capital to cover the massive holes in his fraudulent ledgers. I walked directly over to Vance, effortlessly slipping into his circle of elite investors. I had audited Vance's primary competitor last year, during a federal sweep saving the government millions. While Vance did not know my federal ties, he knew my reputation in the underground financial circuits as an absolute ghost who could read tax code like a native language. Within 10 minutes, I had Vance and his associates laughing, genuinely engaged in a high-level discussion about offshore tax havens and commercial real estate depreciation. I was holding court right in the middle of Julian's sacred hunting ground. It did not take long for the Wilson family radar to detect a breach in their perimeter. I caught sight of Julian staring at me from across the ballroom. His jaw dropped slightly, his eyes darting from my emerald gown to the billionaire investors eagerly hanging on to my every word. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost walk through a solid brick wall. He abandoned Chloe at their table and marched across the room, his face tight with barely suppressed rage. He intercepted me just as I stepped away from Vance's group to grab a fresh glass of sparkling water near the velvet-roped VIP lounge. "What are you doing here, Maya?" Julian hissed, grabbing my elbow, pulling me slightly into the shadows of a large floral arrangement. "How did you even get past the front door? You do not have the capital to afford a general admission ticket, let alone VIP access. Are you trying to embarrass me in front of Marcus Vance?" I calmly but firmly removed his hand from my silk sleeve. "Do not touch me, Julian," I said, my voice perfectly level. "And I am not trying to embarrass you. I am simply networking. It is not my fault Marcus Vance finds my conversation more stimulating than your desperate elevator pitches." Before Julian could formulate a response, his mother materialized beside him. Beatrice looked resplendent in a heavy gold gown, but her face was twisted into an ugly snarl of pure aristocratic outrage. She had spotted me talking to her precious son and instantly shifted into attack mode. Chantal flanked her right side, still looking slightly twitchy after our encounter at her luxury boutique. "Maya, what is the meaning of this?" Beatrice demanded, keeping her voice low to avoid drawing the attention of passing waiters. "You have absolutely no right to be here. This event is for esteemed alumni and honored guests, not discarded wives looking for a handout. You are trespassing." I took a slow sip of my sparkling water. "I am an esteemed guest, Beatrice. I bought my ticket just like everyone else." "Do not lie to me," Beatrice snapped, her pearls shaking against her collarbone. "Julian cut off all your credit lines. You are completely broke. You are unstable and you are causing a scene." She turned to Julian, her eyes flashing with malice. Go find the head of security immediately. Tell them we have a disturbed broke ex-wife harassing our family. I want her physically removed from the premises before she ruins your reputation any further." Julian nodded eagerly, looking relieved to have his mother take the reins. "I will get security right now. You are going to be escorted out the service elevator, Maya, right where you belong." He took exactly 2 steps before a deep, booming voice halted him in his tracks. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" a commanding voice asked. We all turned to see Arthur Sterling walking toward us. Arthur Sterling was a billionaire banking magnate, an absolute titan of Southern finance, and my primary federal contracting client. He was the keynote speaker for the evening and arguably the most powerful man in the state of Georgia. Julian immediately straightened his posture, his anger vanishing behind a slick, obsequious corporate smile. "Mr. Sterling," Julian said, extending his hand enthusiastically. "Julian Wilson from Wilson Investments." "It is an honor, sir. There is no problem at all. We were just dealing with a minor security issue regarding an uninvited guest." Arthur Sterling completely ignored Julian's outstretched hand. He stepped past the arrogant executive and smiled warmly at me. "Maya, what a wonderful surprise," he boomed, wrapping me in a brief paternal hug. "I was hoping you would attend tonight. I was just telling the board of directors about the incredible forensic restructuring you executed for our offshore subsidiaries last quarter." Julian choked on a breath, his extended hand dropping awkwardly to his side. Beatrice stared at the billionaire banking magnate as if he had just sprouted a second head. Chantel looked like she was ready to be physically sick. I smiled warmly at Arthur. "Thank you, Arthur. I appreciate the invitation to your private table tonight. I was just catching up with my soon-to-be ex-husband and his lovely family." Arthur turned his piercing gaze toward Julian and Beatrice. His expression turned instantly freezing. "Ex-husband," he repeated the words dripping with dangerous judgment. "Well, Mr. Wilson, if you are foolish enough to lose my most valued financial strategist, I seriously question your business acumen. Maya possesses the most brilliant financial mind I have encountered in 30 years. Anyone who considers her an uninvited guest at my gala is woefully misinformed." The silence that fell over the Wilson family was absolute. Beatrice opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. Her entire social hierarchy had just been demolished in front of the most powerful man in the room. Julian looked physically ill, his eyes darting frantically between Arthur and me, finally comprehending the sheer magnitude of his miscalculation. He had brought a knife to a nuclear launch. Arthur patted my shoulder gently. "I will be at the main table, Maya. Come join me when you are finished shedding this dead weight." As Arthur walked away, Julian stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. Chloe, his pregnant mistress, wandered over looking confused by the heavy tension. I set my water glass down on a passing waiter's tray and adjusted my clutch. "Enjoy the champagne, Julian." "Julian," I said, my voice carrying perfectly over the jazz music, "because by tomorrow afternoon your accounts will be seized by federal agents, and she is going to leave you the minute the black card bounces." I turned my back on their horrified faces and walked away, leaving the entire Wilson family shattered in the middle of the grand ballroom. The weekend passed with a heavy, oppressive silence from the Wilson camp. Julian had not reached out. Beatrice had not called to hurl insults. I knew precisely what was happening behind the closed doors of their suburban estates. They were regrouping. They were convincing themselves that my connection to Arthur Sterling was a fluke, an anomaly that would not save me from the brutal machinery of family court. They were banking on Richard Sterling to crush me so thoroughly that no billionaire benefactor would ever touch me again. Monday morning arrived with the stifling humidity typical of Atlanta, but the interior of the Fulton County Superior Courthouse was chilled to a sterile freezing temperature. I walked through the heavy mahogany doors of Department 4B with my spine perfectly straight and my heels clicking a steady rhythmic tempo against the polished marble floor. I glanced toward the plaintiff's table and saw the entire Wilson clan assembled like minor royalty holding court. Julian sat in the center wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that screamed desperation for authority. To his right sat his mother, Beatrice, wrapped in a designer cashmere shawl, her chin tilted upward in an expression of absolute disdain. Chantel occupied the seat behind them, glaring at me with venomous eyes, likely still furious about the shattered display case in her boutique. Even Chloe, the pregnant mistress, had been paraded into the courtroom, sitting softly beside Beatrice to project the image of Julian's brand new wholesome family unit. Standing at the head of their table was Richard Sterling. He was exactly as I had pictured him during our phone call. A tall, silver-haired man radiating an aura of expensive arrogance. He was busy organizing a massive barricade of thick legal binders and heavily indexed boxes. I was building a physical wall of paper meant to overwhelm and intimidate me before a single word was even spoken on the record. I walked past the gallery and approached the defendant's table. I carried no briefcase. I had no rolling cart of documents. I held only a single slim, unmarked manila folder. I placed it gently on the center of the dark wooden table and took my seat. Julian leaned back in his chair, his eyes darting from my face to the empty chairs surrounding me. The sheer arrogance that had briefly vanished at the alumni gala came rushing back to him, fueled by the sterile safety of the courtroom and the presence of his highly paid legal attack dog. He let out a loud, abrasive laugh that echoed off the high-paneled walls. "You actually showed up alone," he called out across the aisle, his voice dripping with condescension. "Where is your legal team, Maya? Where is the billionaire backing you up today? You walked into a slaughterhouse alone. No lawyer. You are completely finished. The judge is going to eat you alive and spit out the bones." I did not turn my head. I did not offer him the satisfaction of a reaction. I simply arranged my single folder so it sat perfectly parallel to the edge of the table. "You brought an entire audience to watch you lose, Julian," I replied, keeping my voice low and completely even. "I hope you warned Chloe that she will be paying your legal fees." Before Julian could snap back, the heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed, causing the Wilson family to scramble to their feet. Judge Marcus Carter, a no-nonsense African-American woman with piercing dark eyes and a reputation for absolute intolerance of courtroom theatrics, took her seat at the bench. She arranged her robes, adjusted her reading glasses, and immediately leveled a stern gaze at the room. She was a woman who demanded facts, not feelings, and she possessed a judicial record of eviscerating attorneys who tried to waste her time. She looked down at the docket and then scanned the tables. "I see the plaintiff, Julian Wilson, is represented by Mr. Sterling." She shifted her gaze to my side of the aisle, her brow furrowing slightly. "Mrs. Wilson, the court record indicates you have not retained counsel. Are you expecting an attorney to join you this morning?" I stood up, ensuring my posture projected absolute respect and unshakable confidence. "No, Your Honor," I replied clearly. "I am invoking my right to represent myself pro se in these proceedings." Judge Carter folded her hands, resting them on the polished wood of her bench. "Mrs. Wilson, I must advise you that family law, particularly when it involves significant asset division and contested debt liability, is incredibly complex. Mr. Sterling is a highly experienced attorney. The court will not grant you special leniency regarding the rules of evidence or civil procedure simply because you lack legal representation. You are putting yourself at a severe disadvantage. Do you understand the risks you are undertaking?" "I understand the risks perfectly, Your Honor," I stated, maintaining direct eye contact with her. "I have elected to proceed pro se because my defense does not rely on legal maneuvering or emotional testimony. It relies solely on direct, irrefutable forensic evidence. I require no attorney to present mathematical facts to this court." A faint flicker of intrigue crossed Judge Carter's face before she nodded curtly. "Very well. The court recognizes you pro se. Mr. Sterling, you may proceed with your opening statement and your initial motions." Sterling stood buttoning his suit jacket with a practiced theatrical flourish. He walked slowly toward the center of the courtroom, positioning himself to command the attention of the judge while physically blocking my line of sight to Julian. "Your Honor, we are here today to expedite the dissolution of a marriage that has become financially ruinous to my client." Sterling began, his voice booming with practiced authority. "Julian Wilson is a pillar of the Atlanta business community. He is a hard-working executive who has spent years building a legacy only to have it systematically drained by a spouse who treated his success as her personal slush fund." I watched Beatrice nod in vigorous agreement from the gallery. Sterling paced back and forth, weaving a narrative of absolute fiction designed to paint Maya Wilson as a parasite. "My client is not merely seeking a clean break, Your Honor," Sterling continued, amplifying his outrage. He is seeking immediate protection from the catastrophic financial negligence of his wife. Maya Wilson engaged in reckless business practices, deliberately entwining herself in commercial ventures that are currently operating at a massive deficit. Specifically, she inserted herself as the primary financial guarantor for a luxury retail boutique owned by my client's sister. That business is failing, and Mrs. Wilson is attempting to use this divorce to fraudulently transfer her $1.5 million liability onto my client's shoulders. Sterling walked back to his table and picked up a thick stack of stapled documents, waving them in the air like a victorious flag. We have the original executed contracts, Your Honor. We have the binding commercial lease and the operational credit lines. And most importantly, we have the signed guarantor forms proving unequivocally that Maya Wilson accepted full personal liability for this debt. She signed these documents willingly, and now she is trying to run from the bill. He approached the bench, handing the stack of papers to the bailiff, who passed them up to the judge. I formally submit Plaintiff's Exhibit A into the record, Your Honor. The signed guarantor agreements. We request an immediate summary judgment severing my client from this $1.5 million debt and assigning it entirely to the defendant where it legally belongs. Sterling turned to walk back to his table, shooting me a smug, victorious smirk. Julian was practically glowing with satisfaction, while Chantel crossed her arms, looking vindicated. They thought the trap had snapped shut. They thought the paper with my forged signature was the ultimate trump card that would finally break me. I did not wait for the judge to review the papers. I stood up, my voice ringing out sharp and clear, cutting through the heavy silence of the courtroom. Objection, Your Honor, I stated firmly. Sterling stopped in his tracks, turning around with an exasperated sigh. Your Honor, the defendant cannot simply object to a legally binding contract because she regrets signing it. I am not objecting to the existence of the document, Mr. Sterling, I countered, stepping out from behind my table. I am objecting to its fraudulent misrepresentation before this court. Your Honor, the plaintiff has just submitted a digitally signed document as Exhibit A. I request that Mr. Sterling be compelled to read the embedded metadata stamp attached to the electronic signature he just submitted into the official court record. Sterling frowned, looking genuinely confused. The metadata stamp. Your Honor, this is a delay tactic. The signature is clearly visible on the page. Judge Carter held up her hand, silencing him. She looked down at the document in front of her, and then looked closely at me. Mrs. Wilson, what exactly is the relevance of the metadata stamp? The relevance, Your Honor, is that an electronic signature is not just a visual image on a piece of paper. I explained, my tone clinical and precise. Under the Federal Electronic Signatures in Global and National Commerce Act, a valid digital signature must include a verifiable audit trail. That trail records the exact time the signature was applied and the specific network IP address of the device that applied it. If Mr. Sterling wishes to present this document as legally binding, he must verify the digital audit trail for the court. Judge Carter shifted her gaze back to the wealthy attorney. Her eyes narrowed. Mr. Sterling, the defendant, has raised a valid evidentiary request regarding the authentication of a digital document. You have the original digital file in your exhibit packet. Read the metadata audit trail for the signature into the record. Sterling looked highly annoyed, treating the request like a frivolous interruption. He walked back to his table and flipped to the last page of the exhibit packet where the digital certificate was printed. He cleared his throat, adopting a mocking tone. Very well. The audit trail confirms the signature was executed on October 14th at 2:14 in the morning. The IP address logged is 192.168.1.45. Thank you, Mr. Sterling, I said, taking a single step toward the center aisle. And can you confirm that the geographic location of that specific IP address routes directly to a residential luxury apartment building in Midtown Atlanta? Sterling frowned, looking back at the paper. Yes, the geolocation data indicates a Midtown Atlanta residential network. But, Your Honor, I fail to see how the location of the signing invalidates the contract itself. She could have signed it from anywhere. I turned slightly, locking eyes directly with Julian. His smug expression had completely vanished. The color was rapidly draining from his face as the realization of what was happening slammed into him. She could have signed it from anywhere, I agreed, my voice echoing in the dead silent courtroom. But I did not. Because on October 14th at 2:14 in the morning, I was asleep in the master bedroom of our shared marital home in Buckhead. The IP address Mr. Sterling just read into the federal court record does not belong to me. It belongs to the Midtown apartment leased by Chloe Davis, the woman currently sitting in the second row of the gallery pregnant with my husband's child. The entire courtroom seemed to gasp in unison. Beatrice dropped her designer handbag on the floor. Chloe shrank back into her seat looking terrified. Chantel grabbed the edge of the wooden bench to steady herself. Julian sat completely frozen. His mouth hung slightly open, his eyes wide with a unique brand of terror. He had walked into the courtroom expecting a slaughterhouse. He just never realized he was the one on the chopping block. I turned my attention back to the judge, who was now staring at Julian with a look of absolute disgust. "Your Honor," I said, holding up my single manila folder, "I have the sworn ISP subpoenas and the device registry logs in this folder. My husband Julian Wilson did not just commit adultery. He sat in his mistress's bed, used her internet connection, and actively forged my electronic signature onto federal commercial loan documents to fraudulently saddle me with his sister's business debt." I looked back at Sterling, who was staring at his own client in absolute horror. "Mr. Sterling just submitted physical proof of federal wire fraud directly into the court record," I concluded. Richard Sterling recovered his composure with the speed of a seasoned predator, refusing to acknowledge he had just stepped onto a landmine. He straightened his tie and let out a sharp, dismissive breath. He looked at the judge and then back at me, wearing a mask of supreme condescension. He assumed my technical jargon was nothing more than a desperate smokescreen created by a pro se litigant backed into a corner. He genuinely believed that throwing around terms like IP addresses and geolocation was a bluff meant to confuse the court. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular and absurd," Sterling said, his voice regaining its booming theatrical quality. "The defendant is throwing out wild, unsubstantiated accusations to delay the inevitable. Anyone can spoof an IP address. It is a common parlor trick used by amateur hackers. To accuse my client, a respected businessman, of federal wire fraud based on a string of numbers printed on a digital receipt is an insult to this court." He tapped the thick binder on his table. "The signature on the document matches the defendant's known digital signature perfectly. The metadata simply records network traffic. It is meaningless technical static." Judge Carter did not look amused by his theatrics. She turned her piercing eyes back to me. "Mrs. Wilson, you have made a very serious allegation. Opposing counsel is correct that IP addresses can sometimes be masked or routed through virtual private networks. Do you possess secondary verification that ties this specific digital signature directly to the plaintiff?" I did not hesitate. I reached into my slim manila folder and pulled out a single sheet of heavy bond paper. It bore the raised, embossed seal of a federal cybersecurity auditing firm. I walked calmly to the bailiff and handed him the document. "I do, Your Honor," I stated, my voice echoing clearly across the hushed courtroom. "That document is a verified MAC address registry and geolocation ping report. Mr. Sterling is correct that an IP address alone can be spoofed. However, the hardware identification number of the device used to access the network cannot." The bailiff handed the document to Judge Carter. She adjusted her glasses, reading down the page with intense focus. The silence in the room was absolute. Even Beatrice had stopped adjusting her cashmere shawl, frozen in a state of suspended panic. When Chantel Wilson approached me 18 months ago to streamline the accounting for her luxury boutique, I did not just install off-the-shelf software. I personally coded a proprietary financial management system tailored specifically to her inventory needs. That software contains a standard backdoor security protocol designed to prevent internal embezzlement. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over them. Julian was staring at me, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched near his ear. Chantel looked as though all the air had been sucked out of her lungs. "Whenever a high-liability document is generated and signed within that specific software network, the system does not just log the IP address," I continued. "It executes a deep diagnostic ping. It records the exact geographic coordinates of the network router. More importantly, it captures the media access control address. The MAC address is the unique unchangeable hardware identifier, hard-coded into the network interface card of the physical device being used. It is the digital fingerprint of the computer itself. Judge Carter looked up from the paper, her dark eyes locking onto Sterling. Mr. Sterling, this registry document is certified. The geographic coordinates logged at the exact second the signature was applied point directly to a residential complex in Midtown. Are you familiar with this location? Sterling looked at his client. Julian was gripping the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles stark white. Sterling cleared his throat, attempting to project confidence, but a slight tremor had entered his voice. Your Honor, my client owns several properties and frequently conducts business across the city. The location is immaterial. It is entirely material, I countered, stepping closer to the center aisle. Because the geographic coordinates do not just point to a general midtown location. They pinpoint the exact longitude and latitude of the apartment leased by Chloe Davis, the woman sitting directly behind you. Chloe gasped audibly, pressing a hand to her mouth. Beatrice whipped her head around to glare at the mistress, her aristocratic composure shattering into visible horror. But the location is only the secondary piece of evidence, I said, turning my attention back to the judge. The primary evidence is the hardware identifier. The verified MAC address, recorded by the security software, perfectly matches the internal registry of a 2024 Apple MacBook Pro. Specifically, it matches the device registered to the serial number purchased by Julian Wilson last November. The courtroom remained paralyzed. I let the silence stretch, ensuring everyone understood the inescapable trap Julian had built for himself. The signature on that guarantor form was not made from my own computer, I stated, delivering the fatal blow. It was not made from Chantel's boutique terminal. On October 14th, at 2:14 in the morning, Julian Wilson sat inside his mistress's apartment, opened his personal MacBook Pro, logged into his sister's accounting software, using his administrative bypass credentials, and applied my saved digital signature to a $1.5 million commercial debt guarantee. He forged the document to drain liability from his failing enterprise and attach it to me. The illusion of control finally shattered. Julian could no longer maintain his facade of the composed executive. The cornered animal inside him violently took over. He pushed his chair back with such explosive force that it tipped over and crashed onto the marble floor. He leaped to his feet, his face purple with rage, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She hacked me!" Julian screamed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings, losing all semblance of professional decorum. "She is a psychotic hacker. She planted that data. She planted the MAC address to frame me. You cannot believe a word she says. She has been trying to destroy my life ever since I told her I was leaving. She broke into my computer." Order, Judge Carter barked, slamming her heavy wooden gavel down on the sounding block. The sharp crack rang out like a gunshot. "Mr. Wilson, you will contain yourself immediately, or I will have the bailiffs remove you from this courtroom and hold you in contempt. Do you understand me?" Julian was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his tailored suit. He looked wild, completely unhinged. He looked wildly at his mother, who stared at him with terror and disgust. He looked at Chantel, who shrank away from him, realizing her brother had just guaranteed her federal indictment. He looked at Chloe, who was actively weeping. He had no allies left. He sank back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. Judge Carter turned her blistering gaze toward Richard Sterling. The wealthy attorney looked as though he had swallowed glass. The arrogant swagger had completely vanished. He was staring at the certified document the bailiff had handed back to him, reading the undeniable forensic proof of his client's guilt. Sterling was ruthless but not a fool. He knew exactly what this meant for his career. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Carter said, her voice dangerously calm, "you submitted Plaintiff's Exhibit A into the official record of this court, representing it as a factual binding legal document. You stood before me 5 minutes ago and aggressively demanded summary judgment based on this document." Sterling swallowed hard. The thick stack of fraudulent papers felt like a bomb in his hands. "Your Honor, I assure you I had absolutely no prior knowledge of these forensic discrepancies. My client provided me with these executed documents and represented them as authentic. I operated under the good faith assumption that the defendant had signed them willingly." "Ignorance is a very fragile shield in a federal fraud investigation, Mr. Sterling," I said, breaking the silence. I walked slowly toward the plaintiff's table, stopping a few feet away from the attorney. He looked down at me, the smugness entirely erased from his features. He was no longer looking at a defeated ex-wife. He was looking at his own professional executioner. I held his gaze, refusing to let him look away. I watched the realization dawn in his eyes. He had tethered his prestigious reputation to a man who had used him to commit a federal crime in open court. He had blindly trusted Julian's wealth and status, failing to do the basic due diligence that would have revealed the digital forgery. "Mr. Sterling," I asked, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying register. "As an officer of the court, are you aware of the mandatory federal minimum sentencing for submitting knowingly forged financial instruments during a legal proceeding?" Sterling looked down at the paper. His hands began to shake. Sterling stared at the heavy bond paper resting in his trembling hands. The color drained from his face at a terrifying speed, leaving his skin an ashen gray. He was not looking at a simple tech readout or a printout from a basic software program. His eyes widened as they locked onto the top left corner of the document. Stamped in crisp, undeniable ink was the official seal of the Federal Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN. The realization hit him with the force of an out-of-control freight train. Maya Wilson was not merely an accountant or a bitter ex-wife trying to cause a desperate scene in family court. She was a federal operative. He had spent the last 20 minutes actively mocking a woman who possessed the security clearance and federal backing to dismantle his entire legal career with a single phone call. The heavy legal binders he had so proudly stacked on his mahogany table suddenly felt like concrete anchors tied securely to his ankles, pulling him under. He had knowingly submitted Exhibit A. He had firmly argued for its absolute authenticity before a sitting judge. He had demanded summary judgment based entirely on a document that a powerful federal financial watchdog agency had already forensically flagged as a digital forgery. The mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for submitting knowingly forged financial instruments in a court of law flashed behind his eyes in stark neon letters. He was actively looking at disbarment, federal indictment, and a mandatory minimum of 5 to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. His prestigious reputation, his lucrative corner office, his expensive luxury vehicles, they were all evaporating into thin air right in front of him. The silver pen he had used to confidently sign his own name on the submission filings now felt like a murder weapon burning his fingers. He could physically feel Judge Carter's blistering gaze burning a hole into the side of his head. He could hear the low, frantic murmurs echoing from the gallery behind him. He needed a viable exit strategy, and he needed it immediately to survive. Survival instinct, a raw, desperate panic entirely overrode any remaining shred of attorney-client loyalty he possessed. Sterling swallowed hard, his throat completely dry and constricting. The arrogant, theatrical posture he had adopted earlier was entirely gone, shattered by the weight of federal evidence. He looked like a condemned man standing on a trapdoor, frantically waiting for the wooden lever to be pulled. He slowly lowered the certified federal document back onto the long table, treating it as if it were coated in highly explosive material that might detonate at any second. He took a stumbling, clumsy step backward, physically distancing himself from Julian Wilson. He raised his hands, palms facing outward, in a universal gesture of complete surrender. "Your Honor!" Sterling stammered, his booming courtroom voice completely replaced by a high-pitched, breathless squeak of terror. "Your Honor, I must immediately state for the official record that I was completely unaware these documents were falsified in any capacity." He pointed a trembling, sweating finger directly at Julian, actively abandoning ship without a single passing second of hesitation. "My client, Julian Wilson, swore to their absolute authenticity under penalty of perjury during our private consultations. He assured my firm that the defendant had signed these guarantor forms willingly in his presence. I operated under his direct fraudulent assurances. I am a victim of his deliberate deception, Your Honor. He handed me these files yesterday evening and demanded I submit them to the court today. I had absolutely no prior knowledge of his malicious actions regarding the digital forgery or the IP address routing. I would never knowingly present a fraudulent instrument to this court." Sterling paused, gasping loudly for air, his chest heaving under his expensive tailored suit. He looked at Judge Carter with wide, terrified, pleading eyes. Due to this egregious breach of trust and the severe ethical violations committed by my client, I am formally requesting to withdraw as his legal counsel immediately. I cannot represent a man who has actively manipulated my firm to commit perjury and federal fraud. I respectfully ask the court to release me from all obligations regarding this case, effective this exact second. He took another frantic step away, practically pressing himself against the wooden barrier separating the well from the gallery. He wanted absolutely no physical proximity to the rapidly sinking ship that was Julian. I was throwing Julian to the wolves to save his own skin, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. The courtroom erupted into absolute deafening pandemonium. Julian bolted upright, his heavy wooden chair crashing loudly against the polished marble floor for the second time today. He lunged toward Sterling, his hands curled into tight, violent fists, his face contorted in a mask of pure feral rage. "You coward!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking with panic and unrestrained fury. "You took a $50,000 retainer from me. You told me this case was a guaranteed slam dunk. You told me we were going to ruin her completely. Do not you dare try to back out now. You work for me, Sterling. You are my lawyer. You are supposed to fix this right now." Sterling shrank back, holding his leather briefcase in front of his chest, like a flimsy, pathetic shield. "I do not work for felons, Julian. You lied to me. You handed me a federal crime and told me to read it to a federal judge. You are entirely on your own now. You are going to jail." The sharp, dreaded word jail echoed continuously through the high-paneled room, striking the gallery like a heavy physical blow. Chantel Wilson leaped to her feet from the front row, practically vibrating with hysterical, indignant rage. She leaned over the carved wooden railing, pointing a manicured finger directly at me. "You set him up!" she shrieked, entirely ignoring every established rule of courtroom decorum. "You evil, vindictive witch! You manipulated that entire computer system to frame my brother. He is a good man. He is a successful executive. He would never do this to anyone. You are just jealous because he is building a beautiful new family and leaving your broke, miserable self behind. You planned this whole evil thing to steal his money." She screamed so loudly her voice echoed off the ceiling, causing spectators in the back to cover their ears. Her aggressive outburst only fueled the rapidly escalating chaos. Beside her, Chloe, the pregnant mistress, let out a sharp, terrified wail of despair. She clutched her stomach defensively, her eyes darting frantically between Julian's enraged face and the stern, unforgiving posture of the judge. The realization that her wealthy ticket to high society was currently melting down in a massive federal fraud scandal was finally penetrating her calculated, superficial facade. But the absolute most dramatic reaction came directly from Beatrice Wilson. The imposing matriarch had been sitting frozen, her composure entirely shattered by Sterling's sudden withdrawal and the terrifying mention of federal prison. Now, as Chantel screamed endlessly, and Julian attempted to physically corner his own fleeing attorney, Beatrice began to hyperventilate rapidly. Her shaking hands flew to her chest, clawing desperately at the expensive cashmere shawl draped over her shoulders. She gasped loudly for air, producing a series of sharp, painful wheezing sounds. Her face turned an alarming, sickly shade of pale gray. She slumped sideways heavily against Chloe, clutching her arm with a desperate, panicked grip. "Julian," she wheezed, her voice weak and absolutely terrified. "Julian, do something. Fix this disaster right now." The majestic Wilson family empire was publicly collapsing in real time, reduced to a screaming match, and a severe medical emergency in the middle of a federal courthouse. Two armed bailiffs rushed down the center aisle, moving to physically separate Julian from the retreating, terrified Sterling. The facade Julian spent years cultivating was destroyed, replaced by the ugly reality of criminals turning on each other to survive. Judge Carter grabbed her heavy wooden gavel and slammed it down with a series of thunderous cracks. "Order in my courtroom." Judge Carter roared, her voice amplified by the microphone cutting through the screaming like a scythe. "Bailiffs, secure the plaintiff immediately." Silence descended upon the room, broken only by Beatrice's ragged breathing. Judge Carter adjusted her glasses, settling her blistering gaze entirely on me. The power in the room had shifted entirely. Julian was a humiliated suspect. Sterling was neutralized. I owned the courtroom. "Mrs. Wilson," Judge Carter said, her tone sharp but respectful. "What else is in that manila folder?" I stood up, pulling out a second sheet featuring the unmistakable federal seal. Forging my name for $1.5 million was just Julian's side hustle, Your Honor, I stated. Shall we discuss where the $1.5 million actually came from? Julian's eyes widened in sheer terror. The arrogant facade he had desperately clung to for the past 40 minutes completely dissolved, leaving behind the pathetic reality of a cornered criminal. He looked wildly around the courtroom, searching for an exit that did not exist. I held up the second document from my manila folder. It was a dense spreadsheet cross-referenced with bank routing numbers and offshore wire transfers. I did not need Richard Sterling to read this one into the record. I knew every single digit by heart. For the past 3 years, Julian has cultivated an image of absolute financial brilliance, I stated, projecting my voice, so every person in the gallery could hear the impending ruin of the Wilson empire. He courted high-net-worth individuals and managed massive corporate pension funds through Wilson Investments. He sold them on the illusion of stability and aggressive growth. But the reality is that Wilson Investments has been functionally insolvent for 24 months. Julian was not generating returns. He was hemorrhaging capital on catastrophic real estate speculations and offshore derivatives. Judge Carter leaned forward, peering over her glasses. Mrs. Wilson, are you alleging that the plaintiff lost his client's money and attempted to cover it up? Losing money in the market is a civil matter, Your Honor, I replied. I am alleging that when the margin calls came due, Julian chose to steal rather than admit failure. He systematically siphoned funds directly from the blue-collar pension accounts he was trusted to manage. Teachers' union funds, municipal worker retirement accounts, and municipal bonds. He diverted those assets into dummy corporate entities to maintain his own lavish lifestyle and keep his failing firm afloat. Julian leaped to his feet, his chair crashing backward again. "She is lying!" he screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "That is confidential proprietary financial data. You have no right to possess those ledgers. You stole company property." "I did not steal anything, Julian," I countered, matching his volume with cold, absolute certainty. "I am a federally licensed forensic accountant. I found your hidden subledgers precisely where you carelessly left them on the unsecured server of your home office network. You were too arrogant to encrypt the very files that prove you stole $8 million from working-class pensioners." A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. The gallery, previously murmuring with gossip, now sat in stunned, horrified silence. Stealing from wealthy venture capitalists was one thing. Siphoning the retirement funds of blue-collar workers was a crime that invited a specific kind of public revulsion. But stealing $8 million creates a massive logistical problem. I continued, turning my attention back to the judge. You cannot simply deposit stolen pension funds into a personal checking account without triggering immediate federal flags. The money must be cleaned. It must be integrated into the legitimate banking system through a seemingly valid commercial enterprise. You need a high cash flow business with subjective inventory valuation to wash the stolen capital. I slowly turned to face the gallery, locking eyes with Chantel. She sat frozen in the second row, her designer handbag clutched tightly against her chest. The color had completely drained from her face. "You need a luxury retail boutique," I said, my voice dropping to a precise, lethal tone. Chantel's perfectly manicured hands began to shake visibly. She looked at her brother and then back at me, raw panic setting in. "The $1.5 million debt Julian attempted to assign to me today was never a legitimate commercial loan," I explained, laying the spreadsheet flat on the table. "It was the final wash cycle of a massive federal money laundering operation. Julian funneled the stolen pension money through offshore accounts and routed it directly into Maison de Chantel. He disguised the illicit capital as wholesale inventory purchases." I picked up another sheet of paper from my folder. According to the corporate tax filings submitted by Chantel Wilson, her boutique imported over $2 million worth of luxury Italian leather goods and French silk garments last quarter. But when I cross-referenced those import manifests with international shipping registries and the actual physical square footage of her retail space, the numbers were mathematically impossible. The inventory never existed. Maison de Chantel was generating fake invoices for phantom luxury goods, allowing Julian to deposit his stolen pension money into her business accounts as legitimate retail revenue. They were washing the dirty money through designer handbags that never actually arrived in the United States. The absolute magnitude of the crime finally crashed down upon the Wilson family. This was no longer a messy divorce proceeding. This was a direct roadmap to federal prison. Chantel leaped to her feet, her chair scraping violently against the wooden floor. She did not look at me. She turned entirely on her brother, her face twisted into a mask of pure desperate terror. "You told me it was legitimate investment capital," she screamed, her voice cracking, echoing shrilly through the high ceilings of the courtroom. "You told me those offshore wires were from your private venture capital partners looking to diversify into luxury retail." "I did not know the money was stolen, Julian. I never asked where the wire transfers originated. I just processed the invoices exactly the way you instructed me to." "Shut up, Chantel," Julian roared, spinning around to face his sister. His face was purple with rage, veins bulging prominently on his neck. "You are going to ruin everything. Stop talking right now." "I am not going to federal prison for you," Chantel shrieked back, stepping out into the aisle. "You used my business. You used my boutique to hide your pathetic failures. You told me the phantom inventory was just an aggressive tax mitigation strategy. You lied to me. You set me up to take the fall for your incompetence." "I did not set you up," Julian snarled, pointing a furious finger at her. "You happily took your 20% management cut of every single fake invoice we processed. You knew exactly what we were doing. You used that stolen money to buy your foreign sports cars and fund your ridiculous trips to Dubai. Do not play the innocent victim now. You were perfectly fine with the arrangement when you were spending the cash." The illusion of flawless aristocratic black excellence that the Wilson family had aggressively projected for decades completely collapsed in a matter of seconds. The polished, respectable veneer shattered, revealing the toxic, rotting foundation underneath. The courtroom became the ultimate stage for their dysfunction. "You arrogant bastard," Chantel yelled, tears of panic streaming down her face, ruining her meticulous makeup. "You have always ruined everything you touched. Dad knew you were a fraud. He warned us before he died that you did not have the discipline to run the firm. You only got the CEO position because Mother bullied the board of directors into voting for you. You have been faking your success for your entire miserable life." "Do not bring our father into this," Julian shouted, stepping toward the wooden barrier separating the well from the gallery. "You are a glorified shop girl playing pretend with Daddy's trust fund. Without my capital injections, your pathetic boutique would have gone bankrupt 3 years ago. You are nothing without me." The chaos escalated into a deafening screaming match. They hurled decades of buried resentments and toxic family secrets at each other, completely forgetting the presence of the judge, the bailiffs, and the audience. They were two cornered predators turning on each other to survive, willing to tear their own blood relative to shreds to avoid taking the blame. Beatrice Wilson stood up, her face a mask of absolute horror and profound humiliation. The matriarch, who had spent her entire adult life curating an image of untouchable perfection, was watching her children publicly destroy the family name in a crowded public arena. "Stop it!" Beatrice cried out, her voice trembling with hysteria. "Stop this immediately. People are watching. You are ruining the family name. Julian, Chantel, sit down and close your mouths before you destroy our legacy." "There is no legacy, Mother," Chantel screamed back, turning her fury on Beatrice. "There is only fake money and lies. He stole from pension funds. We are going to lose everything. The house, the cars, the country club memberships. It is all going to be seized." I stood completely still behind the defendant's table, a picture of absolute, unshakable composure amidst the violent storm I had orchestrated. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to hurl insults. I simply watched as the people who had abused, manipulated, and discarded me ruthlessly tore each other apart to save themselves. This was the true face of the Wilson family. Strip away the designer suits, the luxury vehicles, and the arrogant posturing, and they were nothing but cowards willing to sacrifice anyone, including their own flesh and blood, to preserve their selfish interests. I felt a profound sense of closure wash over me. The suffocating weight of their emotional abuse that I had carried for years finally evaporated. I was entirely free. "Order!" Judge Carter bellowed, slamming her gavel down with punishing force. "I said order in this court. Bailiffs, secure the gallery immediately. Anyone who speaks another word will be placed in holding. The two armed bailiffs moved swiftly down the aisle, physically separating Julian and Chantel. The authoritative presence of law enforcement finally pierced through their panic. Chantel sank into a wooden bench, sobbing uncontrollably. Julian stood breathing heavily, staring at the floor, his posture completely defeated. Beatrice collapsed back into her seat, covering her face with her trembling hands. The pregnant mistress. Chloe sat frozen, silently weeping, realizing her promised life of luxury had just evaporated into a guaranteed federal indictment. The courtroom fell into a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by Chantel's muffled sobbing. Judge Carter adjusted her glasses and picked up the dense forensic spreadsheet I had submitted. She read through the first page, tracing the meticulously documented flow of stolen capital from the pension funds, through the offshore routing numbers, and directly into the corporate accounts of Maison de Chantel. She turned the page, examining the phantom inventory logs and the IP address registry matching Julian's computer. She spent 2 full minutes reviewing the data, the only sound in the room, the crisp turning of heavy paper. When she finally looked up, her dark eyes were filled with profound, absolute horror. She looked at Julian not as a respectable executive but as a dangerous criminal. She looked at Richard Sterling, who had strategically retreated to the furthest corner of the plaintiff's table, attempting to blend into the mahogany paneling. Finally, Judge Carter turned her gaze to me. Her expression was a mixture of professional respect and grim understanding. Ms. Wilson, Judge Carter said, her voice low and dangerously serious. The documentation you have provided here is extraordinarily detailed and forensically sound. But you must understand the gravity of what you have submitted to this bench. The allegations of embezzling $8 million from protected pension funds and executing a coordinated commercial money laundering operation do not fall under the purview of a standard civil divorce proceeding. She placed the papers down and folded her hands. This exceeds the jurisdiction of a family court, Ms. Wilson. We do not prosecute corporate embezzlement or federal wire fraud in this department. What you have uncovered is a massive, multifaceted federal crime. I looked at Judge Carter, my posture perfectly straight. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. I am well aware, Your Honor, I said, my voice echoing clearly through the stunned, silent courtroom. That is why I brought guests. The heavy, solid oak doors at the very back of the massive courtroom suddenly swung outward with a violent and highly authoritative force, physically slamming the heavy brass handles directly against the intricately carved paneled walls. The sharp, terrifyingly loud boom permanently silenced all of the remaining nervous whispers in the crowded gallery almost instantly. Every single head in the room immediately turned. Even the Honorable Judge Carter looked up quickly, her wooden gavel suspended, completely frozen in midair. 3 imposing individuals stepped aggressively across the wooden threshold. They moved together with a terrifying, highly synchronized military precision that demanded immediate total compliance. The lead federal agent, a distinctly tall and exceptionally broad-shouldered man, wore a dark tactical windbreaker securely over a crisp white dress shirt. Bold, bright yellow lettering printed clearly across his broad back and chest spelled out the specific acronym that historically struck absolute paralyzing terror into the beating hearts of wealthy white-collar criminals everywhere: FBI. A tough-looking man and a severe woman flanked his sides perfectly, matching his exceptionally brisk and entirely unforgiving pace. As they confidently walked straight down the wide center aisle, the lead agent quickly reached deep into his front pocket and produced a thick black leather wallet. He aggressively flipped it open, proudly, flashing a heavy gold shield that immediately caught the harsh, bright fluorescent light shining overhead. "I am Special Agent Vance," he announced loudly. His deep, booming voice easily cutting through the incredibly stale courtroom air like a sharply serrated steel blade. Representing the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Division. We currently hold a highly classified federal arrest warrant recently signed by a sitting United States magistrate judge. The loud echoing sound of his heavy tactical boots aggressively hitting the highly polished marble floor echoed ominously, like a literal ticking clock, counting down the absolute final desperate seconds of the corrupted Wilson family dynasty. The terrified gallery spectators literally shrank back deeply into their hard wooden pews, incredibly desperate to completely avoid making any accidental direct eye contact. The sheer massive gravitational pull of their federal law enforcement authority entirely sucked all of the remaining breathable oxygen straight out of the large room. Judge Carter very slowly lowered her heavy gavel. She looked at the agents, then shifted her gaze back to me. This was never about winning a simple divorce settlement. This was a coordinated federal sting operation, and she was witnessing the final act. Proceed, Agent Vance. Judge Carter stated, her voice completely devoid of any sympathy for the plaintiff's table. The three agents marched straight toward the plaintiff's table. Richard Sterling, the once mighty legal shark, pressed his back hard against the mahogany paneling, looking as though he was trying to physically merge with the wall. He raised both his hands, displaying empty palms, a desperate silent plea, signaling his complete non-involvement. Agent Vance stopped directly behind Julian's overturned chair. Julian Wilson, he stated, reading from a folded document. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement of protected pension funds, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The female agent stepped toward Chantel, who was frozen against the wooden railing. Chantel Wilson, you are also under arrest for conspiracy to commit money laundering and federal wire fraud. Please step away from the bench and place your hands behind your back. The reality of the situation finally breached Julian's suffocating arrogance. The bespoke charcoal suit that had looked commanding an hour ago now seemed like a ridiculous costume on a frightened little boy. His knees simply gave out. He collapsed. Julian hit the marble floor with a heavy, pathetic thud, falling directly onto his knees. The proud, untouchable executive was entirely obliterated. He looked up at the federal agents, his face a grotesque mask of raw panic. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The air had been completely punched from his lungs. Behind him, Chantel let out a piercing scream as the female agent firmly grasped her wrist and spun her around. No, Chantel shrieked, struggling against the hold. I did not do anything. It was him. He lied to me. I am a legitimate business owner. You cannot do this to me. Do you know who my family is? The agent ignored her frantic, entitled protests, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from her belt. The sharp metallic click of the ratchets engaging echoed through the silent courtroom, a definitive physical period at the end of Chantel's luxury retail career. Julian scrambled forward, crawling on the polished marble until he reached the edge of my table. He grabbed the wooden trim with white-knuckled fingers, looking up at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. Tears were streaming down his face, leaving wet streaks across his perfectly manicured skin. Maya, he gasped, his voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate sob. Maya, please, tell them it is a mistake. Tell them it is a misunderstanding. You know people. You have connections. You built the software, you can fix the numbers. Please, Maya, I am begging you. Do not let them take me away. I will give you anything you want. I will give you the house. Just stop them. I looked down at the man I had married. I looked at the man who systematically tried to destroy my sanity, who had paraded his pregnant mistress in front of me, who had attempted to saddle me with a $1.5 million fraudulent debt to save his own skin. There was absolutely no pity left in my chest. The well was completely dry. I slowly leaned forward, placing my hands flat on the table, looking directly into his terrified, weeping eyes. You wanted me to leave with $0 and a broken Honda, Julian. I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy whisper that sliced through his panicked sobbing. You told your attorney to crush me. You forged my signature while sleeping in your mistress's bed. You wanted me to be the blind, pathetic scapegoat for your massive federal crimes. You wanted me to go to prison so you could play billionaire with stolen money. I am not destroying your life, Julian. I continued, my tone completely devoid of emotion. I am just giving you the exact future you designed for me. You built this cage. Now you get to live in it. A sudden movement in the gallery caught my attention. Chloe Davis, the woman carrying Julian's child, was standing up. She stared at Julian crawling on the floor, sobbing and begging his ex-wife for mercy. She looked at the federal agents securing the handcuffs. She looked at Richard Sterling actively packing his briefcase to flee. Chloe realized in that exact moment that the wealthy, powerful executive she had attached herself to was a complete illusion. Julian was not bound for a life of luxury and high society galas. He was bound for a federal penitentiary. He was utterly, entirely broke and taking his entire family down with him. She pulled her designer coat tightly around her pregnant belly, slipped quietly out of the wooden pew, and practically sprinted down the center aisle. She pushed her way through the heavy oak doors, entirely abandoning the sinking ship. Julian did not notice she had left. The destruction of the Wilson empire was finalized a few rows back. Beatrice Wilson, the tyrannical matriarch who judged and belittled me for a decade, watched her two golden children physically restrained by federal law enforcement. The social standing she worshipped above all else was irreparably destroyed. There would be no more country club dinners. There would be no more boasting about her successful son. There would only be scandal, disgrace, and federal indictments. Beatrice let out a long, agonizing wail that sounded like tearing metal. Her eyes rolled back in her head and her knees buckled completely. She collapsed sideways, falling heavily into the arms of Reverend Silas, an old family friend who attended the hearing to offer moral support to the prestigious Wilson family. The Reverend struggled under her dead weight, calling out frantically for medical assistance while fanning her pale face. Agent Vance stepped forward, grabbing Julian by the collar of his expensive suit and hauling him forcefully to his feet. Julian offered no physical resistance, but his mind was completely fracturing under the immense weight of his total failure. As the heavy steel cuffs clicked securely shut around his wrists, locking his arms tightly behind his back, he snapped his head toward me. His face was a mask of venom. "You planned this from the very beginning!" Julian screamed, spit flying from his lips as the agents began dragging him toward the exit. "You set me up." I walked slowly toward him, stopping just inches from his face. I looked him dead in the eyes, projecting absolute calm. "No, Julian," I said, ringing with finality. "I just finally audited our marriage, and your balance was strictly negative." The heavy oak doors swung shut with a resounding thud, severing Julian's frantic screams from the sterile silence of the courtroom. The echo of the federal agent's tactical boots faded down the marble corridor, leaving behind an atmosphere so thick with shock it felt difficult to breathe. The formidable Wilson family dynasty had not just been defeated. It had been systematically dismantled, exposed, and hauled away in federal handcuffs in under an hour. I remained standing at the defendant's table, the cool, smooth wood beneath my fingertips grounding me in the absolute reality of my victory. Judge Carter let out a slow, measured breath. She removed her reading glasses and pinched the bridge of her nose, momentarily stepping out of her judicial persona to process the unprecedented magnitude of what had just occurred in her family court. When she opened her eyes, the sharp, authoritative edge returned instantly. She turned her attention to the plaintiff's table, where Richard Sterling was aggressively shoving documents into his leather briefcase with trembling hands. His face was a sickly shade of gray, and sweat beaded along his hairline. He was attempting to execute a quiet, rapid exit before the court's full attention could pivot back to his complicity. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Carter stated, her voice slicing through his panicked movements like a freshly sharpened blade. "You will stop packing that briefcase immediately. You are not dismissed." Sterling froze, his hands hovering rigidly over the brass clasps of his bag. He looked up at the judge, his usual booming arrogance entirely replaced by the wide-eyed terror of a cornered animal. "Your Honor, I formally withdrew as counsel. I have no further business in this specific proceeding. I respectfully request permission to leave and contact my own legal representation." "Permission denied," Judge Carter replied, her tone dripping with absolute judicial authority. "You do not get to blindly submit forged federal documents, attempt to extort a pro se litigant for over $1 million, and then simply walk away when your fraudulent foundation collapses. As a licensed officer of the court, you had a strict legal and ethical obligation to perform basic due diligence. You completely failed in that duty. You chose blind arrogance over the law." Sterling opened his mouth to protest, but the judge raised her hand, demanding absolute silence. Bailiff Judge Carter commanded, keeping her eyes locked on the trembling attorney. "You will escort Mr. Sterling to the holding area. He is to remain detained pending an immediate disciplinary hearing before the State Bar Association. I am personally filing the motion to suspend your license pending a full federal review of your active complicity in this fraud." You are done practicing law in my jurisdiction, Mr. Sterling. Two court officers moved swiftly across the room, boxing Sterling in against the heavy wooden table. The highly paid legal attack dog, who had walked into the courtroom expecting a slaughter, offered absolutely zero resistance as they gripped his arms. He looked physically diminished, completely stripped of his power and prestige. He cast one final terrified glance in my direction. I offered him nothing but a cold, indifferent stare as the bailiffs marched him out of the room, ending his prestigious career in absolute disgrace. The courtroom was finally purged of the predators. Judge Carter directed her attention back to me. Her expression softened slightly, holding a distinct measure of professional respect. She picked up her pen and looked down at the original divorce filing. Mrs. Wilson, the judge, said, her voice calm and steady. Given the extraordinary and criminal nature of the plaintiff's actions, I am granting your petition for immediate dissolution of this marriage. Furthermore, based on the irrefutable forensic evidence you have provided, establishing your husband's federal financial crimes, I am ruling that you retain absolute full ownership of your proprietary software firm and all personal assets. You are granted complete, total, and permanent immunity from any liability regarding Maison de Chantel or the $1.5 million commercial debt. That fraudulent burden remains entirely with Julian and Chantel Wilson. She signed the final decree with a sharp, decisive flourish of her pen. You are free, Mrs. Wilson, Judge Carter concluded, picking up her heavy wooden gavel. Court is adjourned. The loud, sharp crack of the gavel striking the sounding block was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the physical manifestation of my liberation. I calmly gathered my single certified document, slid it neatly into my unmarked manila folder, and walked out of Fulton County Superior Courthouse. I walked into the humid Atlanta afternoon air, a completely free and significantly wealthier woman, leaving the burning wreckage of the Wilson family far behind me. The subsequent 2 weeks played out like a highly publicized tragicomedy broadcast across every major local and national news network. The federal indictment of Julian Wilson sent massive shockwaves through Atlanta's elite financial circles. He was denied bail, deemed a significant flight risk, given his extensive offshore banking connections. The highly respected executive was trading his bespoke suits for a bright orange jumpsuit locked inside a federal detention center, while prosecutors meticulously tore through his fraudulent ledgers. Chantel Wilson's spectacular downfall was equally swift and deeply humiliating. The facade of her luxury retail empire crumbled overnight. 2 days after the courtroom confrontation, a fleet of black federal vehicles descended upon the upscale Buckhead shopping district. FBI agents and IRS criminal investigators stormed Maison de Chantel, wrapping the boutique in bright yellow crime scene tape. They hauled out dozens of cardboard boxes filled with falsified invoices, seized her computer terminals, and dragged away racks of the counterfeit luxury goods she had used to wash the stolen pension money. The federal government moved aggressively to liquidate every single asset tied to the Wilson siblings in a desperate attempt to repay the working-class pensioners Julian had defrauded. Chantel's lavish boutique space, a prime piece of high-end commercial real estate located in the most lucrative shopping district in the city, was officially seized by the government. The Federal Asset Forfeiture Division immediately listed the massive property for commercial auction. When I saw the official auction listing cross my digital desk, a distinct thrill of pure strategic inspiration washed over me. Julian had forged my name in a pathetic attempt to steal my hard-earned money to save that exact building. It seemed only fitting that I should be the one to legally and legitimately claim the crown jewel of their shattered empire. The morning of the federal auction arrived with clear blue skies and a crisp autumn chill. I prepared for the event with the meticulous precision of a general dressing for a victory parade. I bypassed the conservative business attire I usually favored for client meetings. Instead, I chose an impeccably tailored emerald green power suit that hugged my frame, perfectly paired with razor-sharp black stiletto heels. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, severe chignon and applied a bold crimson lipstick. I looked like a woman who commanded absolute authority. I looked like a woman who owned the room before she even stepped inside. I arrived at the downtown auction house 30 minutes early. The large, echoing hall was already packed with aggressive commercial real estate developers, wealthy investors, and opportunists looking to score a prime Buckhead property at a steep federal discount. The air was thick with competitive tension and the loud hum of calculating men discussing profit margins. I registered at the front desk, secured my official bidding paddle, and took a seat near the back of the room, observing the crowd with quiet, detached amusement. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a booming voice, took the podium and quickly ran through the legal disclaimers regarding the seized federal property. He projected a slideshow featuring the familiar, elegant storefront of Maison de Chantel. The starting bid was set at a fraction of its true market potential, strictly designed to recover the minimum threshold of the embezzled pension funds. The bidding opened with a chaotic flurry of raised paddles. The price jumped rapidly as three prominent Atlanta developers aggressively fought for control of the prime real estate. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting casually in my lap, watching the numbers climb. I knew the exact physical and commercial value of that building better than anyone else in the room. I had audited Chantel's fake books. I knew the foot traffic metrics, the zoning advantages, and the structural integrity of the space. I also knew precisely how much liquid capital I had securely resting in my business accounts. The aggressive bidding war began to slow as the price crossed the $2 million threshold. Two of the developers dropped out, shaking their heads and lowering their paddles. The remaining bidder, a wealthy silver-haired commercial mogul in a gray suit, smiled smugly, believing he had successfully secured the prize. The auctioneer raised his gavel, scanning the quiet room. "Going once for $2.2 million, the auctioneer called out, his voice echoing across the silent hall. "Going twice for $2.2 million. I smoothly uncrossed my legs and raised my bright white paddle high into the air. $2.5 million, I stated, my voice cutting through the room with absolute unwavering clarity. Every head in the auction house whipped around to stare at me. The silver-haired developer scowled, his smug expression vanishing instantly. He hesitated, calculating his profit margins, and then angrily raised his paddle again. 2.6, he barked. 2.8, I countered immediately, not breaking eye contact with the auctioneer. The room erupted into low, shocked whispers. The male developer glared at me, his face turning a deep shade of red. He gripped his paddle tightly, battling his bruised ego, but his financial backer sitting next to him sharply shook his head. The developer cursed under his breath and threw his paddle down onto his chair, entirely defeated by a woman he had not even noticed sitting in the back row. The auctioneer looked around the room, his gavel raised high. 2.8 million to the lady in the emerald suit. Going once, going twice. The gavel slammed down with a resounding crack. Sold, the auctioneer yelled, pointing directly at me. I smiled, a genuine, triumphant smile. I stood up, smoothing the jacket of my suit, and walked confidently towards the administrative tables to process the transaction. I sat down with the federal agents and signed the official property transfer documents, utilizing my own authentic, verified signature. I had just legally acquired the physical heart of the Wilson family empire. I possessed the commercial deed to the very space Julian had committed federal fraud to protect. The absolute poetic justice of the transaction was profoundly, deeply satisfying. I secured the heavy property deed in my leather tote bag and walked out of the double-glass doors of the auction house. I paused on the wide concrete steps, breathing in the crisp morning air, feeling the warm sun on my face. The heavy, suffocating shadow of the Wilson family was permanently eradicated from my life. Maya. The frail, trembling voice came from the bottom of the concrete steps. I looked down and saw Beatrice Wilson standing on the sidewalk. The transformation was incredibly shocking. The terrifying, imperious matriarch who had terrorized me for a decade was completely gone. The designer cashmere, the heavy diamond jewelry, the posture of supreme arrogant entitlement, it had all vanished. She looked small, ancient, and utterly broken. She wore a plain dark coat, her hair was slightly disheveled, and her eyes were red-rimmed and sunken deep into her skull. She looked like a woman who had spent the last 14 days crying over the ashes of her completely destroyed life. She slowly walked up the first 2 steps, stopping below me, forcing her to look up into my face. She gripped the metal handrail for physical support, her knuckles stark white against the dark iron. I saw the federal transfer listing on the public registry. Beatrice said, her voice cracking weakly. You bought the building. You bought my daughter's boutique. I bought a vacant commercial property. Beatrice. I corrected, my tone completely devoid of sympathy. The boutique was a criminal money laundering front. It ceased to exist the moment the FBI kicked the doors in. Beatrice squeezed her eyes shut, a fresh tear escaping and rolling down her deeply lined cheek. She looked up at me, her face twisted in a mask of profound, uncomprehending agony. She still could not understand how the magnificent Wilson dynasty had fallen so far so fast. How could you do this to us? Maya, Beatrice asked, her voice trembling with genuine despair. We gave you everything. We welcomed you into our home. Julian gave you a beautiful life. How could you be so vicious? How could you systematically destroy our entire family? I looked down at the broken woman. I thought about the decade of relentless, subtle cruelty. I thought about the cruel insults disguised as advice, the deliberate exclusion, the way she smiled when Julian belittled my career. I thought about how she had happily embraced the pregnant mistress, while I was actively fighting for my financial survival. I felt absolutely nothing for her pain. I descended one concrete step, closing the physical distance between us. I looked directly into her weeping, terrified eyes. I did not destroy your family, Beatrice. I stated, my voice perfectly level and devastatingly cold. I just held up a mirror. You should try looking into one sometime. I stepped past her without a single backward glance, my heels clicking a steady, victorious rhythm on the pavement, leaving her standing completely alone in the shadow of the empire I now owned. 6 months can evaporate or drag depending entirely on which side of a heavy iron bar you are sitting behind. For Julian, the passage of time had officially become a suffocating, agonizing crawl. He was currently residing in a medium-security federal penitentiary serving a mandatory 12-year sentence. The man who previously demanded bespoke Italian silk suits and $100 haircuts was now permanently confined to an oversized bright orange canvas jumpsuit that smelled faintly of industrial bleach. His massive fraudulent wealth, his carefully curated high society connections, his unearned arrogant posturing had all dissolved into absolute nothingness the moment the heavy steel cell door locked behind him. He spent his days scrubbing aluminum trays in the prison cafeteria, earning 11 cents an hour. The horrific reality of his new existence was completely unescapable. There were no expensive public relations firms left to spin his false narrative. There were no wealthy venture capitalists to bail him out. He was just another convicted federal inmate stripped of his fraudulent identity, completely isolated from the luxurious world he had so violently stolen to maintain. His sister Chantel was facing her own specific brand of absolute everyday torture. The federal court had mandated full financial restitution to the defrauded blue-collar pensioners. To avoid joining her brother in federal prison, Chantel was forced to liquidate her luxury vehicles, her expensive jewelry collection, and her high-end condominium. She currently lived in a cramped, unrenovated studio apartment in an undesirable zip code. Her prestigious career as a luxury retail mogul had spectacularly imploded. Without her brother's stolen capital to fund her lavish lifestyle, she was entirely unemployable in the high-end fashion sector. Her professional reputation was completely toxic. She now worked 40 long, exhausting hours a week, folding discounted sweaters and processing returns at a brightly lit, big-box retail outlet located in a strip mall. She wore a polyester uniform and a plastic name tag. She earned minimum wage. Every single paycheck was automatically garnished by the federal government, leaving her with barely enough capital to purchase groceries. The flawless aristocratic superiority she had weaponized against me for an entire decade had been completely permanently erased. She was forced to serve the exact working-class people she had previously viewed with profound aggressive disdain. While the Wilson siblings served their respective grueling sentences, I was busy building an impregnable fortress over the ashes of their ruined dynasty. The massive commercial space in Buckhead that once housed Maison de Chantel was entirely unrecognizable. I had gutted the interior, completely stripping away the velvet drapes, the mirrored displays, and the gold-plated fixtures that represented their illicit vanity. In its place, I constructed a sleek, ultra-modern architectural marvel. Polished concrete floors, clean minimalist lines, and floor-to-ceiling soundproof glass walls defined the expansive space. This was the official new headquarters of my entirely independent forensic accounting firm. I employed a specialized, highly aggressive team of 20 brilliant data analysts, former federal investigators, and elite financial auditors. We specialize strictly in unraveling complex corporate fraud, tracing hidden offshore assets, and dismantling massive financial conspiracies. The very building that was once used to successfully launder stolen pension funds was now the absolute premier facility dedicated to catching white-collar criminals. It was a profound, magnificent irony that I deeply appreciated every single morning when I unlocked the front doors. I stepped out of my private elevator and walked onto the main operational floor. The atmosphere was incredibly energized. My analysts were huddled around massive digital displays, tracking offshore wire transfers and identifying shell corporations. The soft rhythmic clicking of computer keyboards and low-focused conversations created a symphony of pure productive efficiency. I walked past the glass-walled conference rooms, feeling a profound sense of absolute ownership. I had not just survived the Wilson family's coordinated malicious assault. I had utilized their immense destructive energy to forge an incredibly powerful new reality. I pushed open the heavy frosted glass door of my private corner office. The room was massive, featuring panoramic wraparound windows that offered a breathtaking, unobstructed view of the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The morning sunlight poured across my large minimalist desk, illuminating the dense stacks of highly classified financial profiles awaiting my personal review. I set my leather briefcase down and walked directly to the window. The city stretched out below me, a vibrant, endless grid of moving cars, towering glass skyscrapers, and limitless financial potential. I was no longer the discarded and underestimated wife. I was the undisputed architect of my own empire. I had systematically dismantled my abusers, legally claimed their prized assets, and built a lucrative enterprise on my own merit. My desk phone chimed softly, breaking my quiet reflection. I tapped the speaker button. "Yes, Sarah," I answered, my voice calm and authoritative. "Ms. Wilson," my executive assistant said, her voice buzzing with clear excitement. "Your 9 o'clock appointment is here. It is Marcus Thorne, the chief executive officer of Julian's former investment firm." I smiled, letting the absolute delicious weight of that specific name sink in. Marcus Thorne was the man who had blindly enabled Julian's rapid rise, who had ignored the massive flags in the financial ledgers, who had profited from my ex-husband's fraud. Now he was standing in my reception area. "He is requesting a private meeting," Sarah continued. "He wants to hire our firm on a multi-million-dollar retainer. He needs you to personally restructure their entire corporate security division and audit their portfolios. He says they are hemorrhaging clients and you are the only forensic accountant they trust." I picked up my porcelain mug, taking a slow, deliberate sip of hot coffee. I looked out over the sprawling city I now quietly commanded. The massive investment firm that had once shielded Julian was now begging for protection. "Send him in," I said, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. "Let us talk about his financial future." Fade to black.